We will see how we can use AWS Code Build to build it. From the AWS Management Console, search for Code Build to access the service. First, create a build project. You can give it any name as well as a description. So in my case, I'll be giving it my code build project and a short description of this. Select source provider as code commit and select your code repository. Select the branch, and I only have one, which is the master branch. Select the image that will be used for your build environment. I'll use a managed Ubuntu image. Select the service role. I have already pre-created a code build role that will grant code build access to S3 to drop the output artifact. Select the option to use a build spec file. Now this build spec file will specify the exact steps required to build the Java application. As you can see here, there are different phases in the build spec file. And what's really important is the Maven install command. Next, select S3 as the destination for the artifact. I will give you a name called web app output artifact.zip. Select CloudWatch logs if you want to be able to collect the build logs. Finally, create your build project. Now let's start the build for our application. Click on Start Build. Ensure that the build project is selected. Source from code commit and branch is master. Let's start the build. You will be able to monitor the logs from the console itself. Once the build is complete, let's take a look at where the artifact was uploaded. And as you can see here, the file is in S3. Now, let's see how we can deploy the application. In my VPC, I already have two EC2 instances as my development server. I'll be showing you how you can use code deploy from the console to deploy the application into it. First, go to code deploy. And on the left, go to applications and create an application. Give it a name. And since I'm deploying into EC2 instances, I will select that option. Once done, let's create a deployment group. Now, deployment groups are essentially targets of your deployment, and you will usually create one for each of your environment. Give it a name. I'll name this web app dev for my development environment. Select a service role. Again, I've already pre-created a code deploy role that allows code deploy to access S3 to retrieve my build artifact and to deploy them onto my EC2 instances. We will do in-place deployment for this. Select EC2 instances. I'll be using tags to help code deploy identify which instances which it should deploy to. And as you can see, I've already tagged my EC2 instances with the value dev web app. And in my EC2 instances, they have the same tags. For deployment settings, I will leave it at all at once. I will also select the load balancer so that it will first block traffic to the instance before deploying. Finally, create the deployment group. Now let's create a deployment. Enter the location of the build artifact in S3. You can leave the remaining of the fields as default. And create deployment. Code deploy will run through a sequence of lifecycle events for the deployment. As you can see here, these are the list of the lifecycle events. Skipping ahead, once done, we can head over to see our EC2 instances. Opening the page, yep. So we have the IP address, and now let's try and open it in our web page. And here, you can see the application being deployed in your development environment. So now let's take a look at our production environment. In my VPC, I already have another 2 EC2 instances as my production server with an application load balancer, and the instances are in auto-scaling group. Right, let's go back to our code deploy application, create another deployment group for our production. Enter a name, we can call it web app prod. Select a service role. This time, we'll do a blue-green deployment. I can select the option to copy my current auto-scaling group to launch the green instances to deploy the new version of my application. Select the auto-scaling group. You can also choose the deployment settings, whether you want to reroute traffic immediately once deployment completes, or choose a duration before it swings over the traffic. You can also specify how long you want the blue instances to remain before terminating them. Right. Now choose the load balancer for the production instance, and let's create the deployment. So if you look at the architecture diagram, once I start deployment, code deploy will create new EC2 instances in another auto-scaling group. And let's start the deployment. Enter the path of the artifact. I will use the same build artifact that is in S3. I will select to also overwrite any existing version, and finally create the deployment. So code deploy will then first create 2 additional EC2 instances, as you can see here. So you see the 2 new instances are being initialized. Once done, it will try to deploy the application code on it. And the third step will be to reroute the traffic. So once the traffic has been rerouted, it will then wait for 1 hour, which is actually the duration which I have specified earlier. But before it terminates the blue instances, I can also manually tell code deploy to terminate them. And yeah, they would be terminated. So now let's see if our production is being deployed correctly. I can take the IP address and open up in my web browser. Now, in a normal CI/CD pipeline, you probably won't want to go in to manually click to build, or even to click to deploy the whole thing, right? So let's now take a look at how we can use AWS Code Pipeline to automate this whole process. So in the AWS service dropdown, click and select Code Pipeline. And you'll see the AWS Code Pipeline console. Click on Create Pipeline. Enter a name for the pipeline. You can then let Code Pipeline create a service role for you. Select a custom location to store your artifacts. I'll be using S3 bucket that I've created earlier. And next. For source, I will select code commit. Select your repository name. And the branch that I'm watching is master branch. And select code pipeline to let it watch this branch for any new commits. As for build, choose code build. Select the build project that we have created earlier. You can also add additional environment variables if you have, right? Things like connection strings, environment variables can be added. And then for code deploy, I will select code deploy, select my application and the development deployment group, review the changes. After you go next. And finally, create the pipeline. Once it has been created, you'll see that the pipeline would be started. But we're going to jump ahead. We're going to edit this to add a few more things to our pipeline. So after you click on Edit Pipeline, you add a new stage. We're going to create a manual approval process here before we deploy into production. So action provider will be manual approval. Select the SNS topic, which I've already pre-created. So this SNS topic will have a subscription that will send an email to the approving authority to approve this once it reaches this stage. Next, we will add another stage here, which will deploy our production application. Type in an action name for this. And for this action, select code deploy with the input artifact from the build stage, from the build artifact. Select the application name and our app production deployment group and save the pipeline. Now we will head over to our application code and make some changes to it. So I'm using Cloud9 as my IDE over here. And going to my Java code, I will then try to make a change in one of the lines at the title. Let's change this to a test message. And remember to save the file. OK. And let's commit this change into Git. Give it a commit message. And finally, push the change in. Now, once the push goes through, it will trigger the code pipeline to start building the application. And once the build completes, it will deploy to development. So you can monitor to see how the deployment progresses. Right? So you can see here, I've made the change to the title as the code commit message. And let's look at the code deploy in detail. So it's going to do in-place deployment as well for the 2 instances. And once it completes, it will send out an approval notification email. So let's now take a look to see if the change that I made to my application has been reflected in the website. Right, so there you go. You can see that the test message is here. And the approver can go in and enter some approval commands and approve this before the stage moves to the next. Once approved, it will kickstart the deployment into production. Right, so it will make use of the blue-green deployment as we have set it up earlier. You can monitor how it goes. And you can see here that it will launch 2 additional instances again as the green environment. Let's skip ahead. It goes through the whole blue-green deployment and it terminates the blue environment. Let's now test if our production has been deployed successfully. Let's take the IP address, put it into our browser, take a look, and there. So the test message is now pushed into my production environment. So you can also test if the load balancer is correctly forwarding the traffic to your production instances as well. So I'm going to head over to my load balancer and get the DNS address, copy it, and put it in my web browser. And there, all good.